Player named Guardsman Bob that was an early League of Legends streamer from Denmark who got pretty high rated on the European ladder in League's first 2 seasons, even though he was someone that was a bit more focused on being a content creator rather than a pro. This guy was one of the more wholesome personalities in the scene in that he was always smiling with a happy, positive face, which we all know how difficult it can be to remain positive while playing solo queue. Seeing him rise up the ranks among Europe's best was a really nice thing that a lot of people in the League community liked to see. But Linak, on the other hand, did not like Bob at all. Anytime they were ever put on the same team together in solo queue, Linak would allegedly do various jerkish things to try and troll him, like selecting the champion Bob hovered or setting him up to fail and then asking teammates to report him, all because he thought Bob was just a bad player. In spite of how toxic he may have been, Linak was happily welcomed into the AAA team as their star player, since he really was one of the best players in the world, even if he could have a nasty side. And with this superstar lineup, Against All Authority crushed the early online tournament scene. Most of League's tournaments back then were weekly online events like the Go for LOL series, where most of the big-name teams in League competed. AAA was one of the 3 teams in Europe that usually traded titles back and forth, the other 2 being SK Gaming and OSK, a sister team to SK Gaming who eventually moved to My Revenge before ending up at Fnatic. All 3 of these teams frequently clashed in online events, as well as at one of the very first offline European events to ever occur, the IEM Season 5 League of Legends Invitational, which had a pretty interesting structure. Only 4 teams were in attendance, the big 3 and Dignitas EU, so rather than have a traditional playoff bracket, the event just had 2 group stage phases. In Phase 1, all teams would play best of ones in a single round robin against each other, where the top 3 would then move to Phase 2. Here in Phase 2, the second and third place team from Phase 1 would play a best of 1, with the loser then playing against the first seed. Finally, the 2 remaining victors would play a final best-of-1 series to determine who was the champion and who got second place. When all was said and done, Against All Authority finished second this tournament, only losing twice to My Revenge, once in each phase. This was slightly disappointing for them, as they had managed to easily beat that squad in plenty of online events prior to this, but second place is still an impressive result, and afterward the team looked to take their talent back home to France, where they continued steamrolling online events. Before long, they would manage to do so well in the League tournament scene that AAA was invited to the European qualifier for the Season 1 World Championship, the biggest tournament that League had seen up until that point. Not only that, but they were also given the number 2 seed for the EU qualifiers, only behind SK Gaming because of how dominant their recent online success had been. That Season 1 qualifier went insanely well for Against All Authority as they continued their incredibly dominant streak. They would start off by beating ALS before managing to topple both Fnatic and Gamed to win the whole event, getting the number 1 seed from Europe for the Season 1 World Championship. This was really exciting for them since they had managed to beat the other 2 teams who would also be representing Europe at Worlds, and seeing as many people believe that EU could very well be the best region in the world at the time, you could make the argument that AAA was the best team from the best region and possibly favorites to win League's first World Championship. At Season 1 Worlds, Against All Authority started off the event with a kind of tough loss to the North American squad Epic Gamer. This was a ragtag group of players who famously didn't practice much or scrimmage together in preparation for events, but who still managed to win tournaments off the individual talent of their solo queue stars. It was a tough loss for AAA as they looked pretty weak against Epic, but NA in general did really well in this group stage, finishing at the top of both groups, so maybe they just had something on Europe. Against All Authority seemingly redeemed themselves, proving their talent by beating Fnatic and Pacific Esports to get second in Group A. This then placed them into the playoff bracket, where AAA started off by breezing past the German squad Gamed before running into TSM. As well as they had done in the tournament up until this point, now was when things started getting much bleaker after they lost a Game 1 of the set, where they had to pretty much play from behind the entirety of the match. Game 2 looked like it was about to be more of the same, as Against All Authority were facing the potential of being knocked into loser's bracket, as TSM had an 11-kill-to-6 lead at the 30-minute mark. Things were looking pretty dire, but AAA managed to steady themselves from here on out. They wouldn't fall any further behind than what they already were, and as they successfully dragged the game out longer and longer, that 4K gold lead TSM had meant less and less. They might technically still be losing, but at this point in the game, everyone had all their key items, and if they just had one good team fight, they could easily bring this series back. Then, at the 50-minute mark, AAA did this.
What's gonna happen here? AAA are actually going into the forest of TSM. And did TSM spot this? Yes. No, they did not. They don't have any ward stem. They have no idea that currently AAA is behind them in the forest.
I don't know if they're going to initiate on the fight here. You see Aurelia coming in strong. They're taking a lot of damage from Corki. Wow! Corki doing so much damage. Yellow Star able to put out that DPS, and a lot falling. It's going to be Kayax going down to the ground, one of the tankier characters right now. The odd one falling, not looking good for TSM in this fight. Great focus coming out of the hands.
Wow, they could take the next. Wow, Regiment 40 and Regiment is gonna fall here. That's game. That's game right here.
This match was significant in that it was a really clutch win for a team that mostly had only performed well when playing at online events. They never really shown this level of collectiveness at a LAN before, but here they were playing from behind all match and managed to keep calm for 50 minutes to sneak in a win, keeping the series alive. In the third and final game of the set, AAA took their momentum and turned it into a victory that would be one of the cleanest wins they got all series, playing from ahead this time, where they finished with a 16-5 kill victory that took them into the semifinal. Here they'd be matched up against Fnatic, the team they had beaten in groups and in qualifiers to make it this far. All they had to do was get a few more victories and they would be the Season 1 World Champions. Against all the odds, it was Fnatic, the number 3 seed from Europe, who went 1-2 in their group and who just lost to AAA in their 2 most recent meetings, that were the ones who emerged as victors, sweeping the French squad in the winners finals and beating them again in grand finals to get League's first ever world championship. It was a shock and something that must have been pretty disappointing for Against All Authority, but then again, a second place finish is still really impressive, certainly finishing as the second best team in the world at League's biggest tournament would establish them as a top team for the future of competitive League of Legends, right? Well, apparently not. Just 2 days after the Season 1 finals, the players of Against All Authority would leave to join a new organization named Millennium. This was a really big shock to the League of Legends community since nobody really knew what was going on or why. The team's roster was sticking together, but to have the second best team in the world change orgs just 48 hours after they were in grand finals was really weird. Some French fans worried about the stability of both organizations, while others allege Millennium must have offered some pretty big cash incentives to make the move happen. AAA put out a somewhat sarcastic headline saying, "Second is not first, so we fired them," while then making their frustrations known in a detailed article venting about how they wanted to keep the team, but apparently the players left after Kuja met with Bjoran, the Millennium manager at the time, in Marseille. Back then, it was pretty normal for teams in esports to change organizations somewhat frequently. Hell, Fnatic's roster had changed orgs twice before settling on where they were, so this swap didn't necessarily spell doom and gloom for these French superstars, but sadly, it would prove to be the beginning of the end of this talented team. With the roster now sponsored as Millennium, the squad seemed to pick up where they left off at first, continuing to enter Go for LOL events online, where they did fairly well, but a few cracks were now starting to show in their structure as the team continued struggling at offline events. At IEM Season 6 Cologne, Millennium kicked off the event well, getting out of group stage with victories against fellow European teams, and even started off the playoffs by getting a victory against CLG, but they would lose to both CLG and Fnatic before getting eliminated in 4th place. The next event was IEM Season 6 Global Challenge Guangzhou, where this was a significant event in LoL's history as it was the first international event held in China. Millennium made the trek across the globe trying to make France proud, but again would manage to come up short, this time getting eliminated in group stage after losses to CLG and Team WE. This was starting to get frustrating for the squad. They still had some of the best individual talents in League of Legends history up until that point. There was no discernible reason that they should be doing so well at online events while struggling to close out matches at LANs. It was almost becoming a bit of a curse that started hovering over the team and seemed to sow some discord between its members. Around this time, rumors began circulating that inter-team feuds were starting to happen, mostly focused around either Kuja or Linac. These are only community rumors from about 8 years ago, let me be clear, but people started discussing mumblings of MoMA leaving AAA a while back because of some sort of difficulties he had with Linac, which wouldn't be surprising considering his past. Other rumors circulated surrounding how the rest of the team was avoiding Kuja for one reason or another. Millennium's roster would continue performing poorly until one day they decided to finally part, going their separate ways. Kuja would go off to start his own separate squad, leaving all the players' futures in limbo, but seemingly right when the players were about to split up, there was a reason for them to all come back together again. The World Cyber Games, otherwise known as WCG, was the self-described Olympics of gaming, an esports event that was structured around rostering teams based on what nation they were from rather than what esports organization they belonged to. League of Legends had a pretty rich history with WCG, seeing as the very first competitive event LoL ever had was run through the World Cyber Games just a year ago, so everyone was pretty hyped for the 2011 edition of the circuit. Because most esports teams rostered players from plenty of different nations, most of the competitors who wanted to enter WCG had to create new separate national teams just for this event with some pretty dramatic roster shifts, but Millennium were interesting in that they didn't have to do that. Ever since MoMA left the squad, they were all French nationals who could enter together, and because of this, Kuja agreed to rejoin the team for the sake of this one final hurrah. On day one, when group stage began, Millennium had a pretty mixed bag of results as they would lose to the Korean representatives as well as a Malaysian team, which was pretty disappointing, although they would beat future Season 2 champions, the Taipei Assassins, as well as a team representing Sweden, which let them escape groups and gave them qualification to the playoff bracket afterward. When all was said and done, day one of this event went pretty well, but that was when everything blew up. Shortly after group stage concluded, rumors started floating around that two of the players from Team France got into a fist fight. This was reported by Absolute Legends to the English community, which, oddly enough, not many people really cared or paid attention to it. When this was posted on Reddit, a few people made jokes about how it was similar to the 2010 French national team's blow-up at the World Cup, but it didn't really get too much focus. Before long, nobody seemed to remember it, other than the occasional pro player who might make reference to what happened in a tweet. However, the French League of Legends community really loved this juicy bit of drama. Against All Authority would actually write an entire article detailing what happened at the event, which I'll read a few Google translated excerpts from. This was on day one of WCG when the League of Legends French national team were hanging along the Counter-Strike 1.6 team from France in the hotel lobby of the place they were staying at. A remark, however, not very witty, of one of the LoL players towards one of his teammates broke a camel's back, which had to accumulate from a good number of disputes. A ridiculous exchange of blows ensued, right in the middle of the hotel lobby and in front of about 50 people. One of the protagonists grabs a butter knife from a nearby cafe and advises the other not to turn his back. In this situation, we take our Samsungs and we film while giggling. Fortunately, there are men, real ones, in this case Rara, to put an end to the scuffle. Conclusion, a black eye, beautiful anecdotes to tell Absolute Legends, a forced reconciliation by the French delegation, and a video of the confrontation. So this obviously gives us a bit more insight into what actually happened. Apparently, Kuja and Linac got into a fight in the hotel lobby, which resulted in Kuja giving Linac a black eye. The scuffle concluded when Counter-Strike player Rara stepped in, and afterward, things seemed to return to normal pretty quickly. Some of the footage we saw later on at WCG showed the team getting along just fine, so this oddly might have not been the biggest deal. And honestly, I don't really know how to feel about it. On the one hand, Linak was a pretty toxic guy in League. He was constantly ruining games for his teammates in solo queue and continued ruining games pretty much the entirety of his early League career, which we'll get into more in a bit. It must have been pretty nice to see a bit of retribution for him to end up on the opposite side of a rough confrontation, as if he was getting his just desserts. We all have our own stories about how frustrated teammates in League of Legends can make us. I mean, imagine how good it would feel if you got to take a shot at some jerk who was constantly ruining your games. But on the other hand, I kind of feel bad for Linak here. Millennium made a pretty big deal out of this whole event in an almost rude way. Later on, when the CS and League teams were together on a bus, either heading to the airport to go back to France or maybe just traveling to WCG itself, someone would film a vlog that included a big close-up of Linak and his bruise, which he obviously doesn't look too happy about. Come to think of it, in most of the footage I've seen of him, Linak doesn't really look like he's having that much fun being a League pro. I mean, maybe this is just something he didn't enjoy all that much, which could be why he was found to be a bit irritable sometimes. Following group stage, Millennium continued playing through the rest of their matches at WCG without much of a hitch, although their performance did begin to suffer from here on out. In bracket, they would win a series in the quarterfinals against the Singaporean team Flash Esports 2-1, which did put them in the semifinals against North American representatives Chickstig Elo. Here, though, they would lose a 2-0 series that wasn't all that close, which eliminated them from a shot at the championship, and instead placed them in the third place match. There, they would face off against CLG Canada, where they would lose 2-0 again, finishing the event in fourth place. Following WCG, the team would finally split up, going their separate ways, which they probably hoped would serve as a new opportunity with a potentially bright future heading into seasons 2 and 3, but would ultimately end in disappointment for most of them. Kuja actually stayed at Millennium, revamping the entire roster, bringing in fresh players with the hopes of building something new, but sadly this new team would never reach that same level of talent and success as the original squad. They struggled at most events, getting last place in a few of them, and sometimes failed to win even a single match in tournament group stages. Kuja would then leave Millennium and try and join a few other teams in the hopes of qualifying for the EU LCS when official regular season leagues began for League of Legends in 2013. He came really close, making it to the offline qualifiers twice, once in the spring of 2013 and once in the following 2014 promotion, but sadly his team would just narrowly fall short at both events. In that 2014 qualifier in particular, he and his team Salade Tomate Oignon were only narrowly eliminated. They got knocked out in a really close group stage that determined which challenger teams would get to fight the incoming demoted EU LCS squads for a spot in the following split. That relegated LCS class was really weak, with only one of their teams re-qualifying in a full best-of-5 set, meaning Kuja could have probably made it back to the LCS if he just won one more game in this group. After falling just short though, Kuja seemingly retired from League of Legends and competitive play. The rest of that old Millennium roster actually stuck together for a while, going back to AAA, bringing MoMA back to mid lane, and signing N-Rated to be their new support, which was honestly a really talented roster that got a lot of League fans hyped when they saw it. In spite of all the ups and downs these players had had over the years, they were still some of the best pros out there in terms of their raw skill and had loads of potential. This Against All Authority roster would have more success than Millennium did, even managing to beat them in a few events where they clashed, like the IEM Season 6 World Championship, but they too wouldn't ever take first place at a major event. After a few years of middling success, some of the players would leave to go on to bigger and better careers, Soaz off to join Fnatic and Yellowstar off to SK Gaming, but Linak actually stayed behind with AAA, trying to qualify for the EU LCS in the 2013 spring split. Against All Authority would make it to the offline qualifying promotional series, but right before the event began, Riot Games announced that Linak would be banned from competitive play for a year. Apparently, he had continued being incredibly toxic in his solo queue games, getting permabanned on one account, then having his behavior worsen, then getting reported in 20% of his total matches with another permanent ban on his main. Because of all of this, Riot would suspend Linac from the Season 3 European qualifier as well as all EULCS competition for 1 year. His ban would then be extended by a year due to not improving his toxic behavior during that period of ineligibility. AAA managed to replace Linac with a jungler named Virtual, who did help them to successfully qualify for the EULCS in 2013, although funnily enough, he would also get banned by Riot for quote-unquote several cases of bad behavior. In retrospect, I honestly think this was just a really sad fall from grace for this team. I mean, personally, Against All Authority was one of my favorite teams to watch in Seasons 1 and 2, and I always hoped they would get their form back from their glory days in the years that followed that Season 1 championship. Some of their players obviously went on to have great successful careers, but I just wish everyone got to join them. I guess not everybody can find happiness through the endless grind of League of Legends. We all know how frustrated and crazy this game can make you. I mean, that's not exactly an excuse to literally fight one of your teammates, or to be so toxic in-game you get multiple accounts banned, but I think all League players can relate to some of the frustrations these dudes felt. No matter what happens next, though, their accomplishments will always be a part of League of Legends history. This is a squad that had a very important place in shaping this game's competitive scene. I just hope that wherever these guys are today, all these players are happy. Thanks for watching. Your own big break and you can finally relax knowing that you've made it.
먼저 저는 여기 아프리카에 들어오기 전에 막 여기저기 팀을 돌아다니면서 그때 연습했던 제가 2부 리그를 뛰었던 모든 연습량을 합쳐도 아프리카에서 했던 연습량을 못 따라갈 거예요 아마. 그 정도로 확연한 차이가 있고 여기 와서 성장한 것들이나 배운 것들이 많아서 차이가 심한 것 같아요. 저는 신인이라는 마음가짐을 가지고 있고 그리고 뭔가 그러니까 제 자리를 위협받는다는 느낌은 안 드는데 또 제가
You know, I think it's fair to say League of Legends esports can be really boring. I mean, every year we see the same regions win the world championships, and not in particularly close sets. In local leagues, 1 or 2 teams almost always dominate individual splits. Even in wildcard emerging regions, there's almost always a singular team who is perennially good and wins every title with ease. It's kind of sad, honestly, how little competition exists sometimes today. But back in the earliest days of League events, things were maybe even worse. In North America, throughout Season 1, the exact same 2 teams won nearly every tournament that occurred by wide margins. Europe was considered diverse for having 3 separate teams that traded their local titles, but that was about the most competitive we'd see things. In China, a dynasty was starting that would rule the eastern region for half a decade. Even when League of Legends eventually came out in Korea, they almost immediately had 2 different teams who were favorites to win every tournament, and those 2 teams, mind you, were sister teams from the same organization. League has honestly always been like this, but in its early years, this caused the game to be in serious danger of having its competitive scene die. If you don't have competition, people aren't going to want to watch your esport, they'll get tired of it and leave. If this game was going to have any kind of future, somebody was going to have to come along and make it fun. Much like the ancient Roman Empire, League of Legends was built in its early years off a class structure. The ruling class were the pro players, which not many teams were able to reach this height in Season 1. The difference between being a pro and being anything else was gigantic. I mean, if you ever saw one of these teams enter a tournament, you would know that they were all but guaranteed to win it. In the region of North America, there were only 2 rosters who ever earned this title of pro: Team Solo Mid and Counter Logic Gaming. The middle class consisted of amateur teams. These were still filled with pretty good players who were sponsored by established esports organizations like Complexity or Curse. The reason they were classified as amateurs, though, was because they just weren't on the same level as the pros. The skill gap between these two classes was honestly a lot bigger than it may look here. For reference, you might find the occasional amateur team winning a tournament here or there, but that would likely only be if no real pros decided to enter. Our third and final class we have to mention were the plebeians, otherwise known as the pleb teams. This class existed because tournaments in League's early days were super easy to enter. Oftentimes there was no registration fee or rating requirement. All you needed was 5 players who could show up to your matches. If you had that, get your guys together, make up a team name, and you'll be seated up against plebs and pros alike with a chance to grind through bracket, testing your skill. Because of the nature of how easy it was to become a pleb team, there were a lot that existed in League's early years, and every once in a while, one of them turned out to be pretty good. One of the earliest tournaments that existed in League was the Newegg Winter WAN Fest of 2010. This was an online event that saw all 3 classes of teams entering and was probably the first major event to happen since League's World Cyber Games appearance 2 months prior. Hosted on the NA servers, the undisputed favorites going into the tournament were Counter Logic Gaming, who had just taken the aforementioned WCG title, but plenty of competitors stepped up to the plate ready to challenge them, one of which was a roster who played under the name Rock Solid. This was a team that was formed by 4 players: Nerit, Rambo, Sam the Ham, and a 15-year-old wunderkind named Voyboy. Like many of the other pleb teams at the time, they entered with the hopes of having some fun testing their skill in this big tournament that was getting a lot of buzz on League's forums. However, they had a little bit of a problem. League of Legends teams are made up of 5 players, and they only had 4. To remedy this issue, Nerit went off scouting the competitive ladder until he found a pretty interesting character who he thought could round out their squad. There was a relatively unknown name who was ranked 3rd overall in solo queue at the time, a Katarina one-trick with a record of 21 wins and only 2 losses. He added the player, who went by the name Skara, and asked if he wanted to join the team. Skara agreed, and Rock Solid's original roster was born. Now, this was the first time Skara had ever played in a competitive tournament, and he was a little bit nervous, so he told the team that he would only play if he was allowed to be their support. He didn't want to have the responsibility of the loss falling on his shoulders if he were to choke by playing a carry role like his native mid lane. The team agreed and shuffled their roster around a bit, officially entering the tournament, so everything was lining up very well, although Skara still had a bit of an issue. One of the reasons he wanted to be their support was because he thought he had a super strong off-meta strategy that nobody would be able to beat him with: Zilean bot lane. This was pre-rework Zilean, mind you. In Season 1, he was mostly played as a mid laner, but Skara believed the revive mechanic coupled with his laning phase harass and boosts could work very well bot lane. The only thing standing in his way from success with this strategy was he didn't own the champion. Skara had only played the character when he was available during a free week rotation, and sadly didn't have enough in-game currency to buy the champ. Rather than spending real-life money on Riot points to make the purchase, the night before the tournament, Skara would grind out matches to get enough influence points to buy Zilean, which he eventually did and got to play him as support in the upcoming tournament. It turned out Skara's Zilean support was a genius strategy. After being seeded into their qualifying bracket, Rock Solid stopped all their competition with 5 consecutive victories, even beating future pro Nat Win along the way. Because this tournament was so big, these were only best of ones, which was meant to keep things moving quickly. This played pretty well into Rock Solid's hands though, since they could pick their innovative Zilean support every single game, not having to worry about someone banning it in a game 2 or 3. After their qualifying success, they would eventually make it to the main bracket and continued stomping all their opponents in best of ones until they were in the winners finals bracket where they would now have to face off against CLG. For a pleb team like Rock Solid, this is normally where they'd meet their fate, getting 2-0 swept by the real pro team, finishing out the tournament just happy to have made it this far. But to everyone's astonishment, they would crush CLG in Game 1. Skara in particular had a fantastic match on Zilean, giving him all sorts of confidence and cockiness. But sadly, this is when the best of 3 series began, and CLG would just ban Zilean the next 2 matches, ultimately taking the set 2-1. Rock Solid would finish out the tournament getting a 3rd place trophy behind Counter Logic Gaming as well as Team OP, which was an early Korean roster, but that didn't really matter all that much. The revolution here had already begun. With their Game 1 victory against CLG, they now had the motivation and the faith that they could go toe-to-toe with anyone. Skara in particular would later talk about how much this set inspired him. He now had evidence that he's just as good as any other pro player out there. They weren't all that special or all that good after all. There was a chance that this class structure was based on a total lie, and a pleb team could potentially rise up and overthrow the system. Over the next few months, the team of Rock Solid would continue entering online tournaments while simultaneously bringing in a few more dedicated players to try and form a main lineup. One of the team's earliest newer members was a player named Locust, who was actually playing with his own squad in that old Newegg tournament, but was friends with Skara from back when they played World of Warcraft together on the same server. They'd become friends in League shortly thereafter, and Skara would recruit him to Rock Solid to be the team's main support. This, of course, would allow Skara to move back to his main role of playing mid lane. The roster was shaping up nicely, although the team still had a little bit of a problem. Their top laner Voyboy, as previously mentioned, was only 15 years old and therefore still in high school. He had a lot of real-life obligations at the time that prevented him from attending many tournaments, so the team wanted to get an extra player on the roster who could serve as a little bit of a backup to him. After looking around a bit, Skara noticed a guy on a team named Oh God Bears, who seemed pretty talented, so he reached out to him asking if he wanted to join Rock Solid. That player was not a top laner. It was a little bit weird that he would be forced to play his not main role professionally, but he was a happy and fun-loving guy who just kind of agreed to join anyway. Eventually, that dude, I'm a Cutie Pie, would find a more permanent spot on their roster as the team's main AD carry. Lastly, as Rock Solid was ironing out their starting lineup, one of their players, Rambo, was beginning to move away from competitive League, getting more into commentating League of Legends tournaments. When he eventually left to pursue a career in shoutcasting, the team would again have another hole to fill on their roster, but would again manage to do so. This time, they brought in a jungler who was a bit of an Udyr one-trick, but was incredibly talented and a very smart theory crafter. His name was Jet, and as he joined the team, he would round out a 5-man roster that would serve as the team's main starting lineup for the foreseeable future. Almost immediately after acquiring these new players, Rock Solid would put up some really impressive results in almost all the events they entered. One of their biggest accomplishments was when they managed to upset TSM in a weekly Go for Lull, taking 1st place overall. This kind of upset was still a little bit rare for them, but they were able to consistently hit top 4 week in and week out in many different online tournaments. Maybe more importantly though, they were also entering and winning a lot of different qualifiers for the few live events that started popping up, such as the IPL, IEM, and MLG tournament circuits. They were quickly establishing themselves as someone who wasn't just one of those pleb teams. I mean, this was a team that was gaining a lot of momentum, and a lot of esports fans really started to love these guys. I know I say it a lot, but I really cannot overemphasize how boring competitive League was, with the same teams winning everything over and over in Season 1, Rock Solid managing to find ways to topple these pro teams and overthrow the oppressive class system was a hugely welcome thing by the community. They quickly gained a dedicated and loyal following who would keep their eyes glued to the screen for every tournament they played in, especially because they weren't just beating pro teams, but they were crushing them in super entertaining ways. For example, their support player Locust would oftentimes run Gangplank's support, which that might sound like a weird strategy to you if you're only familiar with modern League of Legends, but be rest assured, it was just as weird and strange back in Season 1. Locust was this incredibly smart theory crafter and realized that the pre-rework iteration of Gangplank had a few skills that kind of worked well bot lane, specifically if he was played as a support. Namely, his old E ability, Raise Morale, was used by shooting one of your own minions, killing it, and then providing an attack damage and attack speed buff to Gangplank and his surrounding allies. This meant that every time you used it, you would be denying a minion kill from your opponent, preventing them from getting gold and experience and whatnot, and alongside the buff it gave, it made him a very strong bot laner who could consistently be used to go aggressive, trying to get kills in laning phase while also denying farm from enemy AD carries. Locust's Gangplank was honestly one of the most fun things to watch in Season 1 and will always be burned into the mind of Rock Solid fans who got to see it live. Locust wasn't the only fun guy who liked to do weird things though. I mean, everybody on this team was entertaining in one way or another. Voyboy was routinely stomping on enemies with crazy entertaining champions like Akali. Skara was still one-tricking his Katarina to insane KDAs, carrying the team in plenty of different matches. Jat was a dominant jungler with Udyr and Trundle and had a fantastic understanding of jungle pathing and map rotations. And of course, Cutie Pie is pretty much the exact same person he is today, a fun-loving, goofy guy who was always having a good time in-game and out. Eventually, Rock Solid had so much success and became so beloved by the community that an established esports organization noticed them. Before long, they would be reached out to and sponsored by Team Dignitas. One of the more important early events Dignitas participated in was IPL 3 hosted in Atlantic City. This was a big stepping stone for the team since it would be their very first offline tournament they ever attended. Back in Season 1, this was always considered a consequential moment for a roster. People would say, sure, you may be able to have success while playing in online tournaments, but those are played from the comfort of your own home, where you may have a ping advantage and don't have to worry about the stress of being on stage. IPL 3 marked the very first time that Rock Solid, now Dignitas, would be playing in a more high-stakes environment, and this time, rather than playing for $100 in prize money if they win, there was a much bigger prize pool on the line. Unfortunately, Voyboy wouldn't be able to attend this tournament because of his schooling, so the team would have to play with a substitution. Skara would move up to top lane, and a friend of Dignitas named Lo Cicero would end up swapping in to play mid lane for them. Even with this substitution though, Dignitas showed up ready to They started off by sweeping Team Curse 2-0 to make it to the semi-finals. Here, they'd have to face off against CLG. Of course, CLG were supposed to be one of these unbeatable pro teams, but at this point, Dig were well above all that.
Will he go on to, and it looks like he has focused St. Vicious. Was this the right thing to do? He is able to take a lot of damage. They haven't taken anybody out yet, and Big Fat is kind of getting cornered here. Udyr finally falls. Skara able to take down 2. Skara taking down 3 for the triple kill.
All jumping down though onto Chaz. There's the ult coming in. This is scary. Nice Sona dance. They pick up 1. They picked up LP. Now it's on everyone else. Chester is low. Skara hurt as well. Skara could drop down extremely low on health. Staying alive just barely. The true damage could blow him up. Almost about to die. Still alive. Are you serious? And now everyone else
getting onto Udyr. He knows he can't fight this. The Rune Prism about to come back up. A huge fight going down bottom as well. Crescendo's coming out all over the place. Hotshot just making out alive. Forced to flash. Oh, Skara goes in, but he taunts. Will it be enough damage? A very nice ultimate by Skara.
On the other side of the bracket, there was a bit of a surprise where the established powerhouse of TSM lost a narrow 2-1 series against Epic Gamer. This sent Epic into the grand finals where they'd be facing off against Dignitas, which Epic were on a little bit of a hot streak and did have a ton of talent on their team. Dyrus, Westrice, and Crumbs would all shine very brightly in this series, but still, it wasn't enough to take down this new behemoth.
Coming into this tournament, you know, a lot of people were just like, Dignitas. It happened, but it's going to soon be epic. These teams are all using ringers, so we're going to have to see once they can get their final 5 together and get that roster on the field. These are going to be some high caliber teams.
The next event Dignitas would be participating in was IEM Global Challenge New York. This was another tournament that they qualified for while still playing as Rock Solid, and would be their first live event where they got to play with their full roster. However, sadly for Dignitas, they would have a pretty unfortunate result. Although they'd stop TSM in group stage, they would lose 2 best-of-1s against CLG and Fnatic. Due to the limited number of games in groups, this was enough to knock them out of the tournament. Now, this is something I personally dislike about the early League of Legends tournament circuits, where, I mean, there were hardly any games that occurred in some of these group stages, and you could very easily see really good teams getting a little unlucky and being knocked out in groups before given a shot to prove themselves in a real best-of series. I can only imagine how hard it must have been for the players themselves to travel all the way across the country to New York City just to play 3 separate games and 2 disappointing performances sending them home already. I mean, for any normal team, I can imagine players would be agonizing about what could have happened if they just played a little bit differently, bumming them out to say the least. But Dignitas were a little bit odd, and here they would have a guardian angel swoop in to lighten the mood up. One of the ESL hosts and interviewers, who went by the name Carmack, came up to Scara after they were already eliminated, asking for an interview. Now, Carmack is known for 2 things. Firstly, he's known as an incredibly professional esports career man, hosting events, commentating tournaments, running circuits, and even having a high-ranking position at ESL still today. But he's also known for pulling all sorts of pranks on players, and poor Scara was about to be his next victim.
You are Dignitas Pro Gamer, yes?
Correct. My name is Scar. I'm on Team Dignitas, and yeah.
That's 2 best map ever.
What?
That's 2
Yeah.
best map ever.
Yeah. It's pretty cool.
And your team are here tomorrow big?
No. We're out. We couldn't go on. We just
No. Your team are here tomorrow big?
we'll be here, but we won't be playing.
Your team are here tomorrow big?
I don't know, sir. I don't know what you're saying. I can't understand you. Can we get like a Denmark translator over here? All right, but this is my teammate Boy Boy. Say it again. Say what you just said.
Your team are here tomorrow big?
We're here tomorrow. Big?
That's what I thought he said. That's what I thought. Oh my god. All right, ask him.
Your team are here tomorrow big, not normal English?
Yeah. No, that's normal. That's a little bit normal English. You gotta work.
Why no understand?
Hold on.
American.
See, this is one of the greatest parts about Dignitas. Even if they got a super disappointing result, their players would always remain happy and positive throughout it. They had some level of joy that was just so contagious. It was possible to beat them in-game, but it was impossible to keep smiles off their faces.
Shout out to my waifu Miku right here.
Every time you saw these guys do anything, you would find new reasons to love them. Before long, people almost forgot how good they were as players. Their performances were irrelevant to their fans. They started to love them just for their personalities alone. But Dignitas were still really good, it's important to remember, and they had something up their sleeves that they'd be using to reward those fans soon enough. One of the most popular tournament formats in Season 2 was the King of the Hill series. This was a structure where 2 teams would play against each other on a particular week, the victor then getting to defend their title against a new team next week, and so on and so forth until one team was crowned King of the Hill at the end. The next event Dignitas would enter would be one of these King of the Hill series. Hosted by Rampage, this had a ton of impressive talent who would be competing from both North America and Europe. SK Gaming and Fnatic, who were Europe's top 2 teams, would be playing alongside the 5 best organizations from North America, which of course included Dignitas. One thing to mention about this event was it actually had a little bit of controversy surrounding it, specifically with the prize money. The way cash was doled out here was things would start off with 2 teams playing against each other. In this case, it's Dignitas and Complexity in the first game. The winner then becomes King of the Hill and gets $200 for each win. They then move on to the following week and play the next challenger, but here's the catch. If the king is dethroned, the person to dethrone them then gets 50% of what the king won. This means that hypothetically, if there's a king who wins, let's say, the first 4 weeks, playing in week 5, they will only have $200 in prize money on the line, whereas if the challenging team beats them, then they'll earn a prize of $600 because of that bonus. This irks people a little bit since it would kind of punish a team if they were able to be the king for a really long time, which seems like the opposite. You should be rewarding someone for doing so well. But then again, I mean, these are quite possibly the 7 best teams in the world we have competing. There's probably not any sort of way that someone's going to win more than 1 or 2 games in a row, right? Dignitas played insanely well and quickly established themselves as quite possibly the best team in the world. Like in previous events, they didn't just win these games, but they crushed their opponents and did so with hilariously fun and weird champions. Voyboy was still styling with Akali top lane, Skara was picking Heimerdinger mid lane into counterpick champions who were supposed to beat him. Hell, even Jat played Rammus in a decisive Game 3 against Fnatic. We knew Dignitas were good and had talent on their roster, but I think we forgot how good this team was when they were at full force in a best-of-3 setting. They could not only beat the best competition out there, but they could do so in such fun and entertaining ways that mimicked their great personalities so well. The only thing that you could maybe take away from the team at this specific tournament was it was played on NA's servers, so the 2 European teams here had to play with much higher ping. But to be frank, everyone's ping was pretty awful back in those days, and Dignitas were on such a hot streak that I would bet on them to win even if this was a LAN. Really, everybody was rooting for Dig here. They were the newcomers who made League of Legends fun again, who were now apparently one of the best teams in the world. With everything riding high for them, what could possibly go wrong? One of the biggest yearly tournaments in League's first few seasons were the World Cyber Games, which you may remember this event, which was pitched as the Olympics of gaming. It had a lot of historical importance in the League scene since this was the very first LoL tournament that ever occurred at WCG 2010, but it was also just a really cool and unusual event in later years, seeing as it was the Olympics of gaming. Rather than the system we have today where players on teams will come from all different corners of the world, WCG required that all teams competing have rosters entirely from the same country. Like the Olympics, you aren't really competing as a team here, but rather competing representing your country. Each country has online qualifiers to pick their representative, then all countries compete against each other at the main offline event, which WCG 2011 was hosted in Korea and was a super hyped up League event for a few different reasons. The biggest of which was this WCG forced almost every top League of Legends team to swap their rosters around and make new teams. For example, CLG and TSM, who were lifelong rivals, both consisted of American and Canadian players, so to enter the World Cyber Games, both teams would kind of merge their rosters. Counter Logic Gaming would enter the Canadian qualifiers with established CLG stars like Hotshot GG, Elements, and Big Fat LP, who would team up with TSM's Canadian players Chaox and Odd1. Similarly, the reverse happened with TSM, where CLG's American players would team up with the TSM stars on a new team that they would rename to Chicks Dig Elo. Seeing this sort of forced collaboration was a really fun thing for fans, giving us cool what-if scenarios about roster construction that we would never really see anywhere else. Now, Dignitas's players were all from the United States, so they would be entering the American qualifiers, but there was one little exception. Their jungler, Jat, held dual citizenship as both an American and Canadian. Real name Joshua Leisman, Jat was born in Canada and had some old Canadian friends who played League of Legends that he still kept in contact with, and one of his old buddies started a team that he wanted to play in the Canadian qualifiers for WCG and asked Jat if he could help this team out. Now this is where things get a little bit tricky. It's unclear whether Jat actually played in some of the qualifying games or if he just practiced with the team, but he would do something to help out his buddy in these qualifiers. Whatever it wasn't enough, as the team would lose the Canadian qualifiers to CLG Canada, who ended up grabbing the spot. Jat was still playing for Team Dignitas at this time though, and jungled for them as they stomped through the American qualifiers. They would meet up against Chicks Dig Elo in the grand finals of a big double elimination bracket, where Dignitas were coming from the winners bracket and Chicks Dig Elo were coming from losers. Whoever won this best of 3 was supposed to be the American representative for the main event, but this is where things get really, really crazy. Some of the players on CDE, namely TSM's owner Reginald, claimed that Jat shouldn't be allowed to play on Dignitas since he already played in the Canadian qualifiers. According to the WCG rulebook, there is a rule against a player with dual citizenship representing more than one country, the choice of which country is locked in as soon as they participate in any WCG competition. According to Dignitas though, they had already asked WCG admins if Jat was still okay to play with them after his stint with his Canadian friend, where the admins responded sure, because his Canadian qualifying team, quote, wasn't serious. On top of this, Jat was already on the USA team before the Canadian one, so if a team were to be disqualified, it would be his friend's team and not Dignitas. As convoluted as all this was, it seemed like it didn't really matter at first. When it came to the grand final set that was about to be played, the way it was structured was because Dignitas was coming from winners bracket and CDE from losers, Dig would be given a 1-game advantage in their best of 3 series. This meant that if they won a single match, they would win the qualifying spot, whereas CDE would have to win 2 in a row to win it themselves. But in spite of this tough setback, CDE would sweep Dig 2 games to nothing to get the qualifying spot. or at least that's what they thought. It was then revealed afterwards that the American qualifiers supposedly had a bracket reset involved. It appears that no other region had this, but because Dignitas had never been sent to losers, this first loss against CDE would, in theory, send them to losers and then reset the bracket, creating one final best-of-3 series to determine the winner. This is a system that does occur in plenty of other esports, but League had not used it before and, to my knowledge, has not used it since. There were claims that this rule was added retroactively by WCG or even Riot, since no other region used this system, but honestly, it was probably just an issue of the tournament not being run super well. If you scour these old forums, you'll find all sorts of threads filled with players complaining that they don't know who they're supposed to be playing next or when their matches begin. Either way though, Dignitas and CDE had to show up the next day to play their second set and finish out the series. Dignitas then won it and were given the qualifying spot to WCG 2011, which I think you can imagine how the community responded to all this. Seemingly overnight, the perception of Dignitas changed as everybody started rooting against them, as they had now robbed a qualifying spot from some of the most beloved pros from North America's most popular teams. CDE also didn't really help things themselves, as they began complaining about how much everyone had screwed them out of their insane 2-0 sweep. Honestly, the fault staff for having incredibly unclear rules and a horrible qualifying structure, but sadly, of course, it was Dignitas who had to take the heat for all this. Eventually, to compensate for the situation, WCG gave both teams qualification to the main event so 2 American squads would attend. After both made it out of the group stage, they would face off against each other in the very first round of the playoff bracket, which I think you can guess who people were rooting for. CDE would take the series 2-1, advancing in bracket, and would win the rest of their matches without dropping a single game the remainder of the tournament. Later on, the jungler for CDE, CLG's player St. Vicious, said that this was the best team he ever played on. On the opposite side of things, for Dignitas, this tournament was obviously a downer to say the least. Not only did they lose out on the gold and not get to place in top 3, but they also lost out on all the good favor the community had for them and their lovable personalities, and ultimately this would cause quite a bit of fallout. Their jungler Jat would leave the team shortly thereafter, and in tradition with the team's older jungler Rambo, Jat would move into casting. He got a job at Riot Games, firstly on the QA team working on game balance, but eventually built up a career as one of the most beloved casters in the North American professional scene. People obviously moved on from this scandal pretty quickly, and it was largely forgotten as the years went by. In the grand scheme of things, it obviously didn't affect Jat's career, or anyone else's on Dignitas for that matter, but it was still a really sad thing to see happen. This roster had just months ago been hailed as the saviors of League of Legends, who made the competitive scene fun again and brought really cool strategies into the limelight for all their fans to see. But for all they did for us, we would give them a pretty crummy send-off. At this point in our story, I think it's safe to say that, at the very least, Dignitas have established themselves as a very weird team. The things that they've been doing, both as Rock Solid and Dig, are not normal whatsoever. It's not normal for a random pleb team to be able to win major tournaments, beating League's top pros. It's certainly not typical for a random group of guys like that to earn the title of best in the world, even for a brief period of time. It's 1,000,000 to 1 odds that so many great, lovable personalities would all end up on the exact same team, and it's almost equally impressive that those same guys found a way to become so loathed by the community at large. When Jet left the team, it was a really sad watershed moment for the squad, since he was the first departure from their original legendary 5-man roster. Ultimately, this ended up being a turning point for the organization, since now there were some big questions about their future. Was this just a singular moment in history where we got to see this wacky team full of bozos together for a brief period of time? Is now the moment when they start to transition into becoming a more normal and ordinary organization as a whole? Well, there's only one way to find out. Let's go ahead and meet Jet's replacement. I Will Dominate. When he first joined Dignitas, Dominate was still early on in what would turn into a long League of Legends career. At the time, he was only 21 years old, stomping on kids in solo queue and rising up in rating to become one of the most promising junglers in North America. He's also 6'4" and rose for UC Davis. Now, if you had any worries that Dom's addition to this team would somehow make Dignitas more normal, let me go ahead and put those worries to rest. I Will Dominate had been practicing with the team for about a month prior, but he would only officially join Dignitas the day before their next major tournament, IEM Kiev. Now, conventional wisdom says we shouldn't expect Dignitas to be super good since they have a fresh new face and they didn't even perform all that well at their last event anyway. But then again, this is Dig we're talking about, so we maybe shouldn't be all that surprised when they would beat Team Cypher as well as Against All Authority in the group stage to make it into playoffs, and then after losing to TSM, beat SK Gaming 2-1 to get 3rd place. This was a shockingly good performance as Dignitas racked to take advantage of this. The way the event was structured was there were two brackets, a red bracket and blue bracket, where each were both double elimination and the champions of both brackets would meet up in grand finals. In the red bracket, Dignitas started off by beating CLG Black 2-0. They would then beat Team Dynamic twice in some fairly close sets, which was pretty dang impressive as Dynamic had a lot of talent on their team, including future LCS stars Zion Spartan and Zig, but Dig would still eke out wins against them to make it to grand finals and would have to face off against Team Curse. Again, this was a really important match. The way the standings were starting to shape up, whoever lost this would likely have to play against Team Dynamic in the North American Regionals, who were gonna be stiff competition no matter what. Even though Dignitas did just beat them, they were, again, an up-and-coming team filled with future LCS stars, whereas whoever won this series, on the other hand, would likely play against Team Solo Mid Evo, which was a sister team to TSM, who had recently been putting up some much weaker performances and shouldn't be quite as tough. Not to mention, again, there is a ton of prestige getting to hold a first place trophy and $20,000. But there is something in the blood of Dignitas that prevents them from being normal. Funnily enough, their old jungler Jat would be casting this grand final set with Demon, which, as everyone was getting hyped up and excited for game number 1, Jat noticed something kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the tournaments in the past, they're sorting Sonic out. We don't worry about that. But this apparently is real. If we hop over to Champion Select, that's never real. Not in a million years. If that's real, I'd eat my hat, because that is bonkers.
Dignitas and Curse had both picked all random champions, and we're gonna run it down mid lane, game 1 of this ever-important best of 5.
Long, crazy poke on him, and that's going to be a great catch there on towards St. Vicious. St. Vicious is going to poke in there. He's going to dive in with Leona there. It's Varus goes down. St. Vicious drops as well. Curse is going to catch on to Patoy there. Patoy goes down. Westrise picking up a double kill. That's going to work very well. They're going to get a galore poke on towards the tower there. They're going to get the slow on Westrise. Amikutubai is going very deep. He wants that kill on the Westrise. He actually just wants to go buy. That's all they're doing. They just want to simply go back and buy. So he's trying to make abuse of the rules there. Nijaki should get taken out. Crumbs manages to get the kill there. Again, the E coming out from Patoy, just getting that slowdown. St. Vicious going too deep with Leo. And that's going to be Scara being to pick up the kill though. He's going to get taken down, manages to get taken down St. Vicious as well. The mushroom should be enough. He gets 1, he gets 2. Can he get a triple? No, Nijak is going to survive. Cutie Pie will just pop him in the back though. Very nicely done. He is being left to eaten away. They're not going to go for it, but don't worry because the super minions will end this misery for us. Yes, finally Scara is going to shoot it. I'm the Cutie Pie. and Dignitas take game one. And what a strange game it was indeed. 85-66, 31 minutes gone. Thanks for making me cast an Aram, guys.
The rest of the series that was played would see Curse winning, with the final tally being 3-2, but that wouldn't really matter as MLG said this was collusion and stripped both teams of the prize money and circuit points, awarding them to the teams below them. Now, was this collusion? I think probably not. I mean, I don't think that if these teams colluded to split the winnings or whatever, that they would do so in such a blatantly obvious way. I believe that Dignitas genuinely just wanted to have some fun here, and what's more fun than ARAMing Game 1 of a Grand Finals? After all was said and done, Dignitas would have to face off against Team Dynamic after all, round 1 of the NA Regionals, but being the weirdos that they are, they would just win anyway, and in pretty handedly fashion 2-0. This put Skara and company up against CLG once again in the semi-finals. This, of course, was pretty reminiscent of the very first time they ever faced off in the semis all those years ago in 2010. And just like all those years ago, Dignitas took game 1. Whoever won this best-of-3 series would be off to Worlds and the LCS. They'd effectively secure their future in competitive league. The question remained, though, can Rock Solid get more than just game 1?
In there and start a fight.
that's a natural sort of counter to a poke composition.
Right on top of the ward, a body slam through the wall, an explosive amount of damage, and whoa, once again, the rupture ping pong from Casket. That was out deep inside Baron. They try to play the fog of war on this one. Baron very low.
Your turret has been destroyed.
Right now he has 3,500 HP. Boy forced out of this fight. Big Bat taking a lot of damage. Crescendo over from the side. Baron is just doing damage rather than being attacked. Very nice job by Crumbs, able to pick up a double kill for himself. A Caspian surprise, taking down for
Right now, Female wants to go. There's the Australians are going to initiate on. Where's the stun going to go?
Your turret has been destroyed. But Dominic's now alone, he will fall down. Dublin still very, very low. Dominic now healed the damage. Finally, they picked that one up, and now they will go in for the inhibitor. All of them are available, but they've all respawned again. One bad fight's going to be really bad for Dignitas. There's a knockup. Dominic doing a lot. Boy up in